Call the October 17th, 2018 Assembly Finance Committee to order. It's 5:30 p.m. here in the Mona Lisa Drexler Assembly Chambers. Clerk, could you please call the roll?
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. I'd like to note for the record that Ms. Major is excused. Mr. Gray.
Here.
Ms. Dodge.
Here.
Mr. Lawrence.
Here.
Mr. Roberts.
Here.
Mr. Tacky.
Here.
Mr. Lejeski.
Here.
And we're expecting Mr. Quist and Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Quist just walked
And
through the
Mr.
door.
Quist is joining us now.
So noted. You have a quorum.
Excellent, thank you. I think almost everybody here knows where the exits are, but in case of an emergency, there are 3 exits from the assembly chambers, all marked with exit signs. The 2 main doors you walked in immediately behind you, 2 doors to the side. Pick the exit that is the safest means out in case of an emergency, and it'll get you outside. We have no memoranda reports or presentations tonight, or contracts or bid awards. And we have 1 advance ordinance, and that is ordinance number 2018-41. An ordinance amending Fairbanks North Star Borough Code Title VII regarding the school district budget and the permitted accumulation of school district funds. Sponsor is Mayor Castle. There's additional information in your yellow folders, and I will remind folks, I know that this is, there's going to be a lot of questions about this ordinance, but no debating at the Finance Committee, and I sent out a memo to folks I hope they read about what constitutes debate to help answer that question. So with that, Mayor Castle, do you have a staff report?
Mr. Cooper, I've got a quick question.
Sure.
When saying there's no debate, that's amongst the Finance Committee, is that correct? I mean, let me ask you, if school representative, I believe we can have 1 school representative participate in this Finance Committee?
School board representative may participate if they wish to, yes.
And if they were to do that, would they be able to communicate to us their thoughts about the merits of this ordinance?
No.
Because they're not on the Finance Committee.
No. No.
All right. I'll have to wait until next week to find out.
Well,
what
I
they-
presume that if we're not on the Finance Committee, doesn't mean we can't communicate our thoughts. It's
Well,
just that none of us are to be debating, including anyone on the dais.
And to be clear, I don't think it's the thoughts, it's the part where Mr. Lawrence qualified the thoughts about the substantive merits of the ordinance. I think that we can ask questions, we can get information, we can make suggestions or discuss amendments or hypothetical amendments, but as I note from the memo, debate includes comments, speeches, or other arguments as to the merits, e.g. whether or not the ordinance should be adopted. So that's what we need to refrain from doing.
All right.
Thank you. Mayor Castle. Oh, sorry.
Hi.
Mr. Quist.
I'm late.
We already recognized you on your way in,
Okay, thank you.
and we added you.
Thank you.
No problem. And welcome.
Thank you.
All right. Now, Mayor Castle.
Thank you. Well, this ordinance addresses an issue that we've been dealing with for a number of years. You do have more information in your yellow folder, and I suggest you might want to pull out the spreadsheet that's in your yellow folder. Those are current figures. We've been trying to put everything on a piece of paper to make it a little bit easier for you to follow. So both through my introduction here and then I'll toss it to Ms. Brady to go further, but you can check numbers off of this spreadsheet as we go forward. It might be easier to follow and quantify some of the statements we're making. So the school district facility maintenance reserve account is an account that can only be spent on school district buildings maintenance. And back in 2009, you can see on your spreadsheet about halfway down, there's bold letters on the left that say SD lapse to the borough's school district facility maintenance reserve account. And so the 4th column over 2009 is when this was created. To address long-term maintenance in the schools. I think all of you understand, and we've highlighted it quite a bit recently about our maintenance issues and how we deal with that. And so the Assembly's philosophy in 2009 in creating this was that a portion of the lapse or lapsed money, leftover money, unspent, unrestricted operating funds for maintenance go into a facility maintenance reserve account, just as we do. The borough does this the same way. The language can be confusing. Part of the issue here has been different definitions of what constitutes a lapse. I think it's common vernacular to consider the lapse being money that is left over at the end of the year, unspent funds that were budgeted for operation. That still historically has had challenges in defining it. And so this ordinance tries to better define, so we're all on the same page, exactly which funds we're referencing as we go forward. On the line on the spreadsheet that I referenced, you can see that in 2012, about half the columns over, the number that was put into facility maintenance reserve was $800,000. That was when the Assembly put a cap on the amount of money that would go into this fund each year, so that there wouldn't be some sort of a catastrophic impact at one time on the school district, even though it would take a very large lapse in order to do that. But following over farther into the 2014-15 lines, you can see that the lapse was 0. The first two zeros there for 14-15 and 15-16 resulted because the school district came and asked you to waive the lapse those particular years, that they were particularly financially constrained and could not afford to contribute. And so the Assembly voted to waive the lapse those 2 years. The final 0 in the 16-17 column resulted in the formula that we're trying to correct here. This identifies what I would call the problem. The money as defined by the current existing code identifies that we look at the balance in the general fund exclusively, but really when you look on the left-hand side, their unrestricted fund equity on the spreadsheet, the large black letters, really all of those revenue funds are unrestricted fund equity, and Ms. Brady will speak to that a little bit. And it's always been the Assembly's intention that all of those funds be considered as lapsing funds from one year to the next because they're unrestricted. But the way the formula is in code currently, it's only the first general fund. And so this ordinance would total those. So the number that we would be looking at if we were in the 16-17 year there to the far right, would be the $33 million would be the fund balance at that particular time. The reason that we feel this needs to be corrected is that that particular year you can see that there was a $13 million lapse, to use the common language, or increase change from the previous year's fund balance. It went up $13.3 million, and yet there was no money that went to the facility maintenance reserve account that year. It's absolutely zero. That wasn't the intent of our code as it exists today. This is to try to correct that issue. There's been a little bit of a misconception that I think it needs to be corrected. It's been stated repeatedly in the media that if this was to pass, the fund balance carryover maximum would be $9 million. That references 18% of our contribution to the school district in a year. That's not what this ordinance says. It's that 18% plus the federal impact aid number. And so that's the very bottom line of the spreadsheet between all the double lines. And as you can see, last year, that would, or the last audited year, that would result in the school district's ability to have a balance of $20.6 million, not 9, as has been represented by the media. So it's the two numbers combined, the 18% plus the federal impact aid. Quickly, two other brief notes because we want to clarify that we're not intending to have this impact the state money that goes to the school district, and there's no real easy way around it. The way we're fixing it, because money that goes to the facility maintenance reserve account would impact the state funding to the school district. It's not a one-to-one ratio. There's a formula there, and the state calculates that reduction and tells the school district and us what that reduction is. And so on line 49 of the ordinance, it says, whereas it is the intention of the Assembly that it will annually make the school district whole by means of an appropriating ordinance for any negative change in the state aid for school funding arising from any deposit to the school district's maintenance reserve. So the intention here with this is that you, the Assembly, would make the school district whole for that small amount of money. And again, it's not a one-to-one ratio. The other correction, it was never our intent to have this ordinance impact in any way any of the booster club money or bake sale money, any of the collections of money that come in. To the, there's two funds the school district has. In your yellow folder, there's a suggested amendment that we would like to have you make that identifies that this would not impact those funds. The way the wording was, it could be interpreted to impact those funds. That's not our intention, so we want that clarified and would request that amendment go in at some point in time in the discussion. So with that, I think I'd like to toss this over to Ms. Brady, our Chief Financial Officer.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Assembly members. This staff report is a bit long, but this matter is very important, and it's important enough to spend the time needed to gain a good understanding. Feel free to ask me questions along the way, even if it means we have to step back a little bit. I'll also pause at natural breaking points in my staff report to check with you for questions, and I'm happy to provide further information where I can or try to say things in a different way that'll help you in your understanding. I want to start tonight by talking about the legal and financial relationship between the borough and the school district. As stated in the whereases for this ordinance, the Assembly is the taxing authority for the borough and the school district, and as such decides how to allocate limited resources. The borough is the legal entity with authority to bond and borrow funds and has responsibility for all school district facilities. The Alaska Constitution vests all local government powers in boroughs and cities. In accordance with the Constitution, the legislature by law has stated that each borough constitutes a borough school district, and each borough has the responsibility to establish, maintain, and operate a system of public schools on an area-wide basis. The school district acknowledges this in their own audited comprehensive annual financial report and goes on to state that, quote, the borough has delegated the administrative responsibilities for compliance with the statutes to the Board of Education, while retaining certain responsibilities, including the responsibility for funding any deficits. The Borough Assembly remains responsible for approving the school district's total budget and is also responsible for providing a minimum level of local support per state statutes. Under the standards of the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, GASB, this makes the school district financially accountable to the Borough Assembly and therefore a component unit of the borough. Any questions so far? As further stated in the whereases, local sources appropriated by the Assembly to the school district each year are intended to be spent on operational expenses for that year. Therefore, any funds left over at the end of the year were not spent for the operational expenses of that year, and an accumulation of leftover funds is, by definition, money that was not spent for operational expenses. In very few aspects of government, at all levels, are entities, departments, or divisions allowed to carry over spending authority for operations from one fiscal year to the next. Next, I'd like to lay the foundation for the administration's determination of the appropriate level of fund balance for the school district. During the spring of 2017, I was asked to give a presentation to the Assembly about fund balance. Most of you were here for that presentation. Much of this portion of the staff report is excerpted and revised from that presentation that I gave on June 1st of 2017. To begin with the basics, one form of the basic bookkeeping equation is that assets minus liabilities equals equity. Equity is what's left over. Equity is the amount of cash you would have on hand if you were able to liquidate all of your assets and pay off all of your liabilities. Equity in a governmental fund is called fund balance. Governmental funds include the general fund, special revenue funds, the debt service fund, capital projects funds. Equity in proprietary funds is called net position, and proprietary funds include enterprise funds and internal service funds. The Governmental Accounting Standards Board, the GASB, has established 5 categories of fund balance. There's a handout on this ordinance in your yellow folder. It's a packet, and if you've got those all out, the first handout, handout number 1, it shows in descending order from most constraining to least constraining those 5 fund balance categories: non-spendable, restricted, committed, assigned, and unassigned. Note that the term for the total of the amounts in the last 3 categories, committed, assigned, and unassigned, is called unrestricted. That means there are no external constraints on these unrestricted amounts. There are only 2 categories of net position, restricted and unrestricted. And again, as with fund balance, the unrestricted net position amounts have no external constraints on them. Any questions so far? Okay.
Mr. Lawrence, any question?
Could you give me an example of an external restraint?
Grantor funds or a donor who gives money, those sorts of things. Somebody outside, so it's not the legislative body or the administration that's saying we're going to do this with these dollars. It's somebody outside of the entity.
And their contribution is conditioned upon it being used a certain way.
Correct.
All right.
Mayor Castle?
So if the assembly had some sort of a control or restriction on a fund, would that be would the assembly be considered outside?
No.
No.
Nor would the school board.
Other questions? I don't see any, so.
Okay. At that previous fund balance presentation, I talked about the rating agencies, what they do and how they do it. I spoke of their rating methodologies, and I focused on the fund balance portions of those methodologies. For a general purpose government like the borough, which has the power to tax and bond, Standard & Poor's starting assessment considers fund balance of an amount equal to 4 to 8% of expenditures to be adequate. Standard & Poor's then goes on to evaluate numerous qualitative factors, and before issuing a final rating, S&P considers what it calls overriding factors. Moody's, another one of the rating agencies, has a different evaluation scale for fund balance. For general purpose governments like the borough, Moody's starting assessment considers fund balance of an amount equal to 5% of revenues to be at the lowest end of moderate. Furthermore, Moody's specifically addresses the fund balances of school districts, and I've got a handout in there, handout number 2, and I'll go ahead and read what it says on there. Moody's states our scorecard allows for school districts to carry lower fund balances than cities or counties at the same rating level. This is consistent both with existing medians and with our belief that school districts by nature need less fund balance to operate consistently. It's important to note that Moody's is referring to school districts that are obtaining bond ratings. This means these are school districts that have the power to bond, school districts that own their own facilities, and school districts that have revenue-raising capability. None of those apply to our own school district, which as a result would require an even lower fund balance. Consequently, a target limit for unrestricted equity of all funds was chosen to be 5% of general fund expenditures. 5% was chosen because it is within the adequate fund balance range defined by Standard & Poor's and at the lower end of the moderate fund balance level defined by Moody's. Given that the school district would not be the subject of a bond rating because they cannot bond or tax, the administration considers the 5% to be more than sufficient. Any questions on that? Okay. The Government Finance Officers Association has promulgated a number of best practices which represent the official positions of the GFOA. We've discussed GFOA's best practices on fund balance on a number of previous assembly and committee meetings over the years. GFOA's best practice on fund balance makes note that the initial policy assessment of the appropriate level of fund balance should be based on unrestricted fund balances. GFOA's best practice also distinguishes between general purpose governments and special purpose governments. The borough is a general purpose government. The school district is a special purpose government. GFOA recommends that a government's policy on the level of fund balance should take into account each government's own unique circumstances, and that the risks covered by that fund balance should be articulated in a fund balance policy. The borough's policy does just that. It's important to note that the borough's policy recognizes, in addition to its own risks, that the borough's general fund needs to also cover the risks of the funds it subsidizes, which include the school district as a component unit of the borough. It could be construed by the taxpayers as excessive accumulation to have both entities holding fund balances for the same school district needs and purposes. Any questions? Okay. The administration's objective with this ordinance is threefold. First, the administration wants practice to match original intent of the current code, as the mayor has spoken to you about. The Assembly's appropriation for the local contribution to the school district is intended to be used for operations. To the extent that is not used for operations, it is not needed by the school district for those operations. The current code requires a portion of the unneeded funds to be deposited to the borough's maintenance reserve fund for school district facilities. This is very similar to the borough's own code requirement to deposit 2/3 of any fiscal year lapse to its own facilities maintenance reserve fund. Despite the school district's increasing fund balances, there have been no deposits from the school district to the borough's maintenance reserve fund for school facilities since fiscal year 2013-14.
Well, can wait till you're finished. I'm just getting on your.
Yep, this is fine.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I'm curious about how we separate what we give for operating money versus what the state gives for operating money. Does the state give also only operating money? Is it, can we track it through? Do we prorate it? Does that kind of make sense, that question? Do you know what I'm asking? You want me to try it again?
No, governmental accounting does not track those sources. You know, we give it for operation, the state gives it for operations. The school district is not obligated to keep track of
Goes in one
how much
bucket?
is ours.
Right. So how would
Now,
you?
there could be other state dollars that have to be segregated. You know,
Right.
they have certain federal pass-through dollars and those sorts of things, and those do have to be tracked separately, but not their general operating dollars.
So how would we know that they didn't use borough funds and that $6 million of borough funds weren't used for operations? Would it be prorated based on lapse?
That's a policy call, I would say. The ordinance, if you look at, let me find the line here. Lines 46 and 47. Whereas unrestricted fund balances of the district are considered to be accumulated from borough contributions.
So are we claiming all of them? Because we aren't going to give it back. So let me say that differently. The attorney looks worried.
No, I'm not worried. I think Ms. Brady's explained this to me before, so I was kind of waiting for her to say it. So they have a policy on how they spend the most restricted funds first. So they're going to
state are the most
spend
restricted?
restricted grant funds first, and then they're going to spend state because they have a limitation on carryover amount from the state funds,
Right.
and then they'll spend the borough funds last.
So they might, though, consider ours more restricted if we do this. Might they do that?
I don't think that would make sense for them because then they would be potentially running afoul of the state's carryover amount. So
Okay.
I don't.
Yeah.
And
So it might be-
It's either in policy or isn't it set in the CAFR?
It's in their summary of significant accounting policies in their audited comprehensive annual financial report.
So we're spending down most restricted, and then next most restricted, which we're thinking is the state, but there is a certain amount of that they can set aside. So they could say that 10% could be less restricted, then roll into our money until we get. Is that how that would be done?
That would be up to them, but that's a pretty complex.
potentially
Most
how-
governmental entities do not go to that level of complexity in disclosing what their spending policy is.
But conceivably, they could do that. They could say, we're going to spend the state down to absent the minimum or the maximum we can keep, and then we're going to start at the borough money and spend that down. And then whatever's,
But as Jill said, I think they would run afoul of the state statute fund balance limitation.
because the
Yeah,
goal is
because-
to spend the money, not to,
Correct, and it's the unreserved portion of its year-end fund balance and its school operating fund is how the state carryover is calculated. So it's those amounts that are greater than 10% of its expenditures for that fiscal year, and then there's a regulation that
oh, it's 10%
sets
of
out-
expenditures, not monies given.
Right,
Okay.
right. So I think they'd have to meet that standard before then they spent borough funds.
Okay. So, but conceivably, that's how it would go. And so we're arguing that whatever's left over at the end of the day is borough.
The borough contribution
operating
kind of
money.
fills the hole. We're kind of the, what do you need to balance your budget? And so and then that sets what the assembly needs to tax to the the tax it needs to apply to the taxpayers.
So we're claiming all of our money is filling the hole and that we should be the last dollar spent. And if there are dollars still remaining, then
We would have levied less taxes if they hadn't needed our dollars.
right. And that's what we are arguing would be eligible for a lapse discussion. Is that correct? Mostly?
Yes, without parsing words, yes.
Oh, okay.
I think that's the, yeah.
Then generally, that's
Yeah.
what we're suggesting. Thank you.
Mr. Lawrence?
So the state limitation or restriction would require that if the district carried over more than 10% of the amount of expenditures in that fiscal year, then the state's going to pay us all less next year because of that. And the state they're not keeping track of whose dollars were spent,
Correct.
whether it's state or borough.
Correct.
And, all right, so there's really, I mean, that's not an issue as to whose dollars are being spent first, right?
Not in my mind.
Okay, I don't see how it is either. Okay.
Just as far as what we're claiming is not spent is ours, is what I was trying to understand.
All right, well, I would
Yep.
suggest that any money that's,
Mr. Lawrence?
okay, well, isn't any money provided to the school district from any source, whether it's the state or the borough or the feds, is our money, right?
Ms. Brady can
The-
answer that.
Well,
I mean, it's,
to the extent that we all have the same taxpayers,
And to the
yes.
extent that we operate a central treasury, however, it's for school operations. It's not borough. It's in our capacity under our education power.
all right.
I don't have the code with me, but the code talks about when the school district budgets, they're responsible for telling us, the mayor, how much they need to balance their budget. That's codified. And so those are the dollars that come to us, and that's the last dollar that goes in. They have to do all their other dollars first under the code requirement for their budgeting.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Roberts?
Yeah, so you said the money would all be for operations, but they do have a maintenance department doing small maintenance tasks. Are you including that when you say operations?
Yes, I am.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions at this point? I don't see any, so please proceed.
The second part of the threefold objective is the administration wants the school district to have the ability to efficiently manage day-to-day operations with an amount of fund balance that's reasonable and appropriate. I discussed the rationale for what is reasonable and appropriate earlier, and will reiterate that it's based on criteria used on a nationwide basis by 2 of the 3 major rating agencies in the world. Allowing the retention of fund balance at the level proposed in this ordinance gives the district finite flexibility to manage the types of unforeseen circumstances likely to be encountered by the district, given the district's limited risk exposures. A couple examples are that the district has no community responsibility for natural disasters and no major maintenance responsibility for any facilities. The third part of the objective is that the taxpayer should not be unduly burdened with additional taxes to meet borough requirements if there's a disproportionate amount of unused funds being retained by the school district. The constitutional construction of the borough school district financial relationship places the responsibility for taxing and resource allocation directly on the borough assembly. The borough assembly has an obligation to make those decisions in the best interest of all of its citizens. Now I'm going to talk about the spreadsheet. Are you ready?
Ready.
So this is a historical spreadsheet that covers fiscal year 2006-7 to fiscal year 2016-17. That's the latest fiscal year that's audited. This spreadsheet applies this ordinance's concepts to the historical amounts. The first two lines of the spreadsheet calculate the target amount. Based on the information from Standard & Poor's and Moody's rating agencies, 5% of expenditures was determined to be an appropriate target amount. So those are those first two lines as if they had been applied to the historical numbers. In determining the appropriate maximum amount of school district fund balance, the next two lines of the spreadsheet calculate a limit of 18% of the borough's local contribution to the school district as of July 1st of each year. The resulting amount approximates that 5% of expenditures target above. The local contribution is determined by the borough assembly each year and cannot be altered by the school district. This body could decide that something other than 18% is more appropriate, and you can discuss that at your regular meeting if you choose. Any questions about those first four lines?
Ms. Dodge?
I don't have a question, just an observation. It's striking how similar those two targets are.
Yes. So, and I guess that's because the relative proportion of the borough contribution to their total operations is fairly consistent.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Mr. Lejeski?
Wait, so we're comparing these numbers to that bottom line of 20.6 million for the most recent fiscal year?
I'll get there.
Okay, I'll wait.
Okay. Yeah, but if you confuse you along the way or you need some clarification, pop in.
So I'll just to clarify, this would be the proposed, according to these experts, as it were, or these agencies, this would be their...
The target is...
The target.
The target is, what we've done is use the local contribution as the base instead to get something that would be something that's within the Assembly's control.
Thank you.
Sorry, Mr. Lawrence.
Why are we taking 18% of the local contribution rather than 5% of the total receipts or total revenue received by the school district?
So it's more common to use a target based on expenditures because they're more consistent. Revenues can vary more. Does that answer your question?
Okay, well, but the ordinance proposes an 18% that it talks about, I mean, it's based upon the total contribution, right?
Right, and the reason for that is because that's the one thing in the school district budget over which the Assembly has control. And it approximates what that 5% of expenditures would be.
Well, I mean, the purpose of this ordinance is to put sideboards on how much the school district can accumulate in unrestricted funds, right? So if you just said a minute ago that expenditures are in many ways a better measure of perhaps of what a school district is doing, and yet this ordinance proposes taking a percentage of our contribution.
Right, and our contribution, as I stated also earlier, is fairly consistent in terms of proportion to their total budget.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Okay, Mr. Lejeski?
Right, so I'm trying to review some things you've already said. So the 5% is the Moody's number for the low end of moderate for a bonding school district.
Yes.
Which is 9.6 million for the last fiscal year. And we got the 18% because it's a similar number, but it's based off of expenditures rather than revenue. Is that where the 18 is coming from, or?
No, the 18% is of the borough's local contribution to the school district for education,
Right, but why?
because that is the only number in their budget that this body controls.
But we'll say, well, like, why not 17%? I think that's
It-
what our general
you
fund
could-
target is. Why not 20%, you know?
Okay, the 18% is not of expenditure. So on the borough side, we use 17% of our expenditures. And that's also based on rating agencies, GFOA's best practice, and some of those sorts of things. That's for a general purpose government with our qualitative factors and overriding factors and other things that we need to consider. On the school district side, they're a different kind of entity, and this ordinance proposes using 5% of their expenditures instead of 17% of their expenditures as a adequate, moderate, sufficient fund balance level. And then the 18% is just, so that's the target, and then the 18% is using a base that's within the control of the assembly and trying to target that 5% amount.
Okay, that's okay, that just answered the question
Okay.
right there.
Okay.
Mayor Castle?
Well, yeah, I guess just to add a little bit to that. So we're taking 18% of the local tax dollars. So these are our local citizens' money that we're looking at. It's the money that we've put into the bucket from our local community as the basis for the calculation, and you have control over that, how much we're putting into it. And it reflects that the local community dollars could or should be engaged in facility maintenance. The community owns all of those schools, and their money that we're taxing them on, we feel, philosophically, that should be spent on the schools, buildings, the structures on it. And it's important to note also what I mentioned earlier, too. That's not the entire retention bucket. They also would be able to add the federal impact aid to that. That takes it to the bottom line number, the 20 million number. So we're not focusing just on that 9 million that we're talking about now, the 18% number. It's really both of them put together.
Ms. Dodge?
So now you've clarified for me that I'm confused.
I'll get to the part that Mayor Castle was talking about on the impact aid advance.
No, that's not the part
That's not
that
the
I'm
part,
confused
okay.
about. I thought we were talking about this being the amount that we would allow the school district to lapse, but the mayor seemed to be indicating this would be the amount that we would lapse to FMR, so that's why I'm confused.
Neither of those.
Okay, then I'm more confused than I know. Perhaps you can
So
clarify
what we're
for me.
talking about is a proposed limit on the amount of unrestricted fund balance across their funds
They would keep.
that
I
they
used
would
the wrong
keep,
term. That's
that they
what I
could
thought
keep.
we were talking about.
Yes.
But the mayor seemed to be talking about it being used for FMR. So is this
Any
the...
excess over that would be used for FMR.
Thank you.
Other questions? I guess maybe a question for Ms. Dolan. Could the assembly set the limit at 5% of expenditures rather than 18% of local contribution?
Possibly. I would struggle with that, though, because the only thing you really have control over are borough dollars, and to the extent that that may not be only borough dollars, I'd hesitate.
So an approximation based on the local contribution would be the better.
I think looking at it this way, which is that by appropriating all the money in the first instance, it's been available for the district to use all year. So to the extent that it's not used for that purpose, you're saying it's almost a conditional appropriation, and so you're saying that's clearly ours and we're going to take it back, versus we're going to look at your whole budget and look at what you've spent, which isn't clear that it's the borough appropriation that's at issue.
No, thanks, that helps
So yeah, does that...
clarify the logic, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, other questions at this point?
I think Mr. Quist was first.
Oh,
but
sorry,
I'll
Mr.
go with-
Quist.
Thank you. So, there's a restriction on the maximum amount of contribution from the district, like of the lapse to the school district's FMR that was 800,000 and then 1 million. How does this ordinance interact with that
This ordinance deletes the current code section and replaces it
entirely? So there would be no limit on the
as it's
required
proposed,
contribution
correct.
to FMR as it is right now. Thank you.
All right, then Mr. Lajewski and Ms. Dodge.
Just thinking operationally, would it be difficult if the number was changed from 18% to have a formula dictate what it is? A formula that might better approximate the 5%?
Depends on what the formula is.
Over a 5 or 10-year history of
like
the
a rolling
percentage
average of some
times
sort?
The borough amount that equals the average, like, 10 years of what the 5% would have been, something like that.
Maybe, but I think you get back into the comment that Ms. Dolan made about then you're looking at things other than the borough taxpayer dollars.
I could see that, okay, yeah.
Additional questions? Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Dodge.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Not meant as a debate, but as an observation, since one of the comments allowed by our esteemed finance chair was possible ideas for amendments. I just have to say that when I hear 18% of tax dollars that are given to the school district might be eligible for retention by them, that is like $1 in $5 that we are taxing people to give to the school district that could be retained. And just as an observation, that is striking to me.
Mr. Lajewski?
So I got a question I should have asked earlier. Does Moody's make a recommendation for reserve amounts for non-bonding authority, taxing authority, school districts?
I do not know. They are a credit rating type, credit worthiness.
Right, so it wouldn't be in their business interest to do that, would it?
Yeah, I don't know if they would if somebody asked them to, but that's not what they typically do. They'd have to pay for it, obviously, but so do we.
All right, other questions at this point? All right, Ms. Brady.
Let's see. So the next section on this worksheet is that Mayor Castle touched on was this unrestricted fund equity section in the middle that's in black with the bold capped letters, unrestricted fund equity. And this is also historical audited amounts, and it includes both the unrestricted fund balances of the district's governmental funds and the unrestricted net positions of its internal service funds. And note that this ordinance excludes the unrestricted fund balance assigned for the impact aid advance. So the school district gets impact aid in advance of the year for which it's intended, and it excludes that, which the mayor has touched on. And then what this means is that this exclusion allows the district to carry over more than double the calculated portion of the carryover amount. And I'll talk more about that later when we get farther down the spreadsheet. A second thing to note in this section is that unrestricted fund balances committed in the local program special revenue fund and in the school activities special revenue fund are not contemplated in this spreadsheet. And as the mayor noted, it was not the administration's intent to include these in the limit calculations, but the ordinance itself doesn't make that clear. So that last handout in your packet that's labeled handout number 4 is a proposed amendment to this ordinance to exclude the committed amounts in those 2 special revenue funds from the calculation for your consideration next week.
Ms. Dodge has a question.
I do. I'm confused again. Today the K in Catherine stands for confused or something. So I was under the impression that that the school district was being left with like $2 million at the end of the year for general fund, and this clearly is not. It seems like that's what I heard during budget meetings or something, and clearly that's not the case, and hasn't been ever apparently. Is that correct?
So these are from their audited statements.
Thank you.
Mr. Lawrence?
Couple of questions. In these unrestricted fund amounts, the parenthesis indicates that that's not a deficit. I mean, that's money that is owed to that fund, not sitting in that fund, right? Or
Correct. That is correct.
okay, and could you give me, this proposed amendment would exclude the school district committed fund balances and the local program special revenue fund. Could you give me some examples of what those local programs are?
Bear with me while I pull it out here. So, Options Childcare, Barnett Magnet After School Program, Walmart Community Grant Program, Bridge, community donations. So those were a few examples from their list.
And then the Students' Activity Special Revenue Fund is for sports and music and things like that?
That's what I would presume, but I didn't see anything that tells me that in their financial statements. But that's what my thought would be.
All right, thanks.
Let's have Mr. Roberts and Mr. Quist.
So, when the Assembly changed the lapse to the school district FMR via the last ordinance,
Oh, I see.
there was a lot of talk about what unassigned meant and could they just move money at the last minute and avoid it. And so, is that what happened in this last audited year, the 2016-17 year? Did that exact case that we had talked about actually happen?
Yes.
That's why there's a $0 amount?
Yes, but I would be remiss if I didn't point out that the state limitation came into play first. And so they were over that 10%. And so they were, after the fact, when I say after the fact, after the end of the fiscal year, so in October, they went back and moved money out of their general fund into other funds so that they would not hit up against that 10% limit in state statute.
By them trying to keep more money from the state's lapse requirement, they also just happened to evade the borough's lapse requirement.
Correct.
Thank you.
I can't speak to their intent, but other than what was in their board minutes.
Okay, thanks.
Have Mr. Quist and Ms. Dodge.
Thank you. I have two, if I may, but just to kind of follow up on my last question. So this ordinance deletes 704-120, which has that $1,000 limit in it.
The $1 million limit.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
$1,000 limit in it, and replaces it with this proposed code. But I guess my question is, so first off, it seems like there's quite a bit in here that isn't captured in the new ordinance. My question is, what would the effect be of just changing the values in 704-120, the percentage, and removing that amount? I mean, could we accomplish the same thing here? Maybe I'm not asking my question very well.
No, I think I understand your question. What's being proposed is a brand-new methodology because the old methodology was, there were disagreements about what lapse meant. There were disagreements about what was held in other funds. There were disagreements about moving funds around, and the new methodology kind of puts those off to the side and says, those can't be done anymore. This is how we're going to look at it.
Thank you. And if I may, okay, I don't know how well you can speak to this since this is a school district fund, but I'm looking at the Risk Management Internal Service Fund, which is the one that currently has the larger balance. And if you look at excluding the most recent number here, I mean, if you look at the average balance of this fund is some like negative hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I mean, I guess my question is, what is the typical balance of a fund like this, and is almost $8 million in this case irregular?
So a couple responses to that. First is that and I can't speak to this specifically, but the school district changed their methodology of how they operate that fund a couple times. And so they had, in their early years, they had some lag provisions in their collective bargaining agreements about how they refunded that fund from employees. And I cannot speak to the specifics, but that was some of the early years. The other thing is that governmental accounting standards require that over time a risk management internal service fund be break even. So having a $7.9 million fund balance is pretty substantial to a fund that should be operating over time to break even. But that's over time is a judgment call. So, you know, in the spring they talked about having a plan to use up those funds over, I think it was 4 years, or I can't remember specifically, but it's a judgment call whether that 4 years is within what the GASB standards say.
Thank you.
Mayor, did you have a response to Mr. Quist as well, or you want to?
Yeah, alluding to the new structure and why the new structure is here, what we wanted to do is make sure the school district had the ability to still move funds around. So this in no way restricts them from moving funds from one account to another. It just says that when we're looking at what their total fund balance is, we look at all of the accounts listed here, not just one of them. They can still move money, so there's no restriction on that whatsoever.
Thank you.
All right, I have Ms. Dodge and then Mr. Gray.
And I'm really kind of making a comment to myself and to us. We're used to talking about general fund and lapsing of general fund, and that's kind of what I was talking about with that, you know, understanding that it had been lower. But I'm realizing that, of course, it's this bottom line sum of all unrestricted fund entities that is actually what we're calling general fund lapse for purposes of this, or general fund.
We're
Balance.
expanding general
Right.
fund unassigned to be all of these unrestricted balances.
Let's see, I have Mr. Gray, then Mr. Lawrence, then Mr. Lejeski.
Sure. Is it normal to make that kind of fund transfer, so to speak, 3+ year or months after the end of the fiscal year that was made?
It piqued our interest. It looked unusual to us, but I can't speak to a more global universe.
Seems unusual. That's all. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Lawrence, then Mr. Lejeski.
I just kind of want to nail this down, but current code, you know, and providing for a lapse into the facilities maintenance reserve fund covered only the school district's general fund.
Correct.
All right, so a major change in this ordinance is to cover all the funds. So if, you know, so as to deal with the possibility of them shifting everything around to avoid lapse. All right, thanks.
Mayor Castle looked like he had a
Yeah,
response.
exactly that. It's just, when you look at the fund balance, because the school district has the ability to move funds back and forth, take school board for some of these or superintendent for some of these, but, I mean, they're not restricted, so money can go back and forth between any of the 5 accounts listed here, and, well, soon to be 6. And the intention is that we're looking at their total fund balance, and so that's the aggregate of all of these accounts, is truly their unrestricted fund balance. That's what our intention has always been, and this clarifies it. That's the model that we're using for this new structure.
Mr. Lejeski.
So when it comes to the school district FMR, if we had a $5 million roof project for a school and they had $2 million in there, can we just appropriate $2 million out of that to help fund it and then $3 million from borough accounts? Or how does that work? So I don't know, whoever wants
Yes,
to
but I
answer.
believe the way the fund is created, you have to first get recommendations from the school board before you spend money out of that fund.
Would that come usually in like the form of a resolution?
I believe that's what they've done historically, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, Ms.
too.
Brady's also nodding her head, yeah.
I'm not super familiar with that process, but that's my understanding.
Okay, because if this thing gets passed, it sounds like the school district FMR will have more money, and so that'll become more of a relevant question. Then the other, this goes back to my first question, but we're getting rid of Moody's, since, yeah, it was sort of a silly question. Anyways, what I'm wondering is, do we know what other school districts like ours have as a target reserve?
I do not know.
And then if we don't, Adina, I don't know who's doing research. That might be something I'd be interested in seeing if, I don't know who replaced your old position, but I'd be interested in knowing, especially what other school districts in Alaska might be doing
Sure.
that are similar to us in taxing.
I will work with Miss Brady on that.
Other questions at this point? Oh, Mayor Castle?
Back to Mr. Lejeski's first question. So historically, what we've done is the school board gives us a resolution on a specific project endorsing expenditures of money from that. It's my understanding that's not a legal requirement. It's been something, Ms. Dolan can check on that, but there was a time when we had a time-sensitive project and we were not hearing back from the school district school board with a resolution, and we moved ahead with the project. It's my understanding, and correct me, again, I guess to legal, but the money so there's a school district maintenance reserve fund, and there is a borough maintenance reserve fund. The school district maintenance reserve fund, those monies can only be spent on school district buildings and not appropriated for borough buildings. The borough's maintenance reserve fund monies can be spent on either on our buildings or the school districts. And we have at times when they didn't have the money, we have rounded off the project with money. That's up to you folks. Obviously, you make those appropriations. But just like the total fund balances, it goes downhill and it can't come back up. It's the same with the maintenance reserve funds, the two of them. So people have used the phrase that we're taking money back. We're not really taking money back. These lapsed dollars go into the school district maintenance reserve fund that can only be spent on school district buildings. So it's still school district funding and supporting that effort. It isn't money that's coming into our maintenance reserve fund to be used on other borough buildings. So it isn't a take back per se. It's a move over from operating dollars to more of capital type dollars in the maintenance reserve account, if that makes sense.
Yep, that makes perfect sense. Yep.
Ms. Dodge?
Mayor, how much was it that we were looking for the Barnett School remodel?
14 million and change.
Thank you.
Any other questions at this point? I've got two questions, if I might. One, this is, I guess, a drafting question, a technical question. That may be, would it make more sense in drafting the funds that are included in unrestricted fund equity to say what is not included? And the reason I'm asking this is, presumably the district could add or remove internal service funds over time, like they're the equipment replacement internal service fund is relatively new, and it occurred to me that one possibility is that internal service funds could be created outside. I mean, we say including but not limited to, and so maybe something that Ms. Dolan can think about. I don't necessarily need an answer right now, but that occurred to me that the internal service funds could come and go.
So that was why we said include but not be limited to, so that if new ones are created. But we wanted to ensure, or I should say the intent of the sponsor was to ensure that all the fund equity that's unrestricted was included, and those are the known funds right now.
I was thinking all funds except, I don't know. Anyway, that occurred to me. And then I wanted to ask one more question, and that's actually going back to 5% of expenditures versus 18% of local contribution. So sorry to shift back, but
That's okay.
But this is kind of based on a trend where the relationship between the local contribution and expenditures has been fairly consistent over time. What if that changes? How does that affect how this ordinance would operate? So say a future assembly gets a wild hair and appropriates either a lot less or a lot more.
So
Because then we're no longer
I
matching
didn't
that
go out
target.
and predict the future,
Right.
but if it's a lot more, then they could retain more.
Right.
If it's a lot less, they couldn't retain as much, but they could still come before you and ask for a waiver or say we need X dollars to do Y or whatever. It wouldn't preclude those, just like they asked for waivers in the past.
Thanks. And that was part of that question, is about the waiver. It just occurred to me that depending upon that local appropriation, we could be above or below the target. It's been consistent over time, but that could change in the future. So, Mayor Castle.
Yeah, and so this isn't something that is so bomb-proof that it should be frightening. There's 3 remedies if somehow the school district ends up where this is particularly onerous. Ms. Brady pointed out they can ask for a waiver like they have for a couple of years, and the Assembly's accommodated them, and they could keep the money and be immediately remedied. They can come to you folks and ask for a special appropriation. Takes a few weeks, and they would be remedied. Or they could wait 6 months and address it at the budget cycle and say, we need to be made whole here. This drew us down farther than what we should be, and they explain it to you, and I think the Assembly's always been accommodating. So there are 3 remedies should this get us into a sticky wicket, so to speak.
Additional comments? Ms. Dodge?
So I don't recall anymore what the complicated equation was that we used to use to determine lapse. Can you remind us of what it was?
Okay, so which one? The original
The the Ms.
'Cause
Winters one
we have
from
several.
2009, when the lapse
so
was
the
like
first one-
2.1 million.
So the first one from 2009, it still had the language in there that the school district could carry over amounts, the unreserved local appropriation fund balances not exceeding 7% of the local contribution to education for the fiscal year.
So it was 7%?
Yep, but then the first 28.5% of the total annual lapse to the school district FMR fund for the purposes of maintenance and upgrades to facilities.
So, so if there was a lapse of $1 million, 28.5, 285,000 would go to FMR, school district FMR?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And was that basically the formula?
Yes. Yeah, I can send you, I actually have a kind of a chronology of the amendments to the lapse ordinance if you want me to send that to you.
If it's easy, sure. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. I think Ms. Brady has more presentation to go, so I'm going to give Ms. Brady an opportunity to continue on. Oh, sorry,
Just
Mr. Quist.
On this, so 28.5%, how do we get that? I mean, I see 25, but, or maybe I misheard, but
That was the 2009 version of the,
okay, thank you very much.
yeah.
Thank you.
Ancient history.
All right, anything else before we let Ms. Brady continue on? All right, Ms. Brady.
So let's see, where did we leave off?
Finish the
I
middle
think we
section
finished
of the...
unrestricted fund equity, mostly.
Some of this we've kind of covered, so I'm scanning through my notes here. And we already talked about waivers too. So I think some of what I had here we've already discussed. The next section, that balance in borough school district facilities maintenance reserve, that's the actual dollars that have been in that fund at June 30th of each of those fiscal years. And so that's just information for you. And that very last amount is estimated and unaudited, that $2,271,244.
And I think I see where some of that money has come from, but where has that come from? Is that money that we have?
So in a couple of those years, I don't know how much you recall, but there was a cash payment school construction reimbursement program, and when we spent money out of this reserve, we got 80% back from the state, and that went into this fund.
Thank you. So that's where a lot of this is, the last 4 years have come from,
Yeah.
probably. Thank you.
And that's now done and gone, and the state has closed that project. And then the next little section there, the next two blue lines are comparative numbers for each of the fiscal years, two different comparative numbers. The first line shows the proposed limit compared to the 5% target. And you can see that the 18% of the local contribution approximates that 5% target. You can see some years are up, some are over, some are under. And then the second line there shows the amount of unrestricted equity that is over or under the proposed limit calculated in accordance with this proposed ordinance. So if you look at that last year there, it's about $12.5 million. That would be over the proposed limit as the ordinance is in its introduction state. And then as a matter of policy, the Assembly could choose a different proposed limit percentage and amend the ordinance. So this is based on that 18% of the local contribution. Then the next line is for your information. This is the historical amounts of fund balance assigned for the impact aid advance. And the impact aid advance is unrestricted dollars. When added to the calculated limit amount, as shown on the last line of the spreadsheet, it almost doubles the unrestricted fund balance the school district is permitted to accumulate under this ordinance. For example, at the end of fiscal year 16-17, the school district would be able to retain over $20 million of unrestricted fund balances under this would have been under this proposed ordinance. And applying this ordinance historically, the unrestricted fund balances that would have been permitted to be retained range from 10.7 to 13.5% of expenditures, and the average over the 11 years that they would have been permitted to retain was 12.1% of expenditures in total between those two, the calculated amount and the unrestricted impact aid advance. So I went through that kind of fast. Any questions on that part? Okay.
So the 12% compares to the 5% target, so it's more than twice the target.
Yes. Yep.
Other questions at this point? See Mr. Lawrence and Ms. Dodge.
Trying to anticipate the impact of this ordinance. If passed as it reads, it's retroactive to last June 30th, 2018. And so how does this, assuming that this is the law, how does this apply? I mean, when would there be there'd be some excess funds at what, calculated at the end of this fiscal year?
At the end of the June 30th, the year that just passed. So
Okay,
it does exclude, so the school district has already adopted a budget for FY19 that included a draw on their fund balances. That's off the table, so they would keep that in addition to these calculated amounts. And then as the audit is complete, we would know what amount would have to come back to go into to be deposited to the school district facilities maintenance reserve.
And when would we know that? That's when this fiscal year is, when the audit for last year, fiscal year is completed?
Correct.
Okay, based upon an unaudited figure for last year, how much money is going to transfer to the?
We don't know that. Their books aren't closed. There's a kind of a big thing for all of us in the state is that the State Division of Retirement Benefits has not provided us with the data to implement GASB Statement 75 for other post-employment benefits. Consequently, neither the school district nor us nor any other municipality in the state can close their books if they're a June 30th year end until we get those numbers from the state. So my understanding is their audit's gone, timing-wise, has gone pretty well. But can't close without those numbers if you're going to present gap basis financials. So
under this ordinance, Ms. Dolan, when last fiscal the school district's budget their fiscal year is audited and the audit is complete, is completed, at that point then there will be a transfer or maybe a transfer of funds at that time.
Correct.
I think just maybe if I can help clarify for Mr. Lawrence, I think that, money out of their adopted budget for the current year is what would come back. Is that right, Ms. Brady?
No, because the proposed ordinance doesn't care about how they operated. It cares about what their balance was at June 30th, what their unrestricted fund balances were at June 30th. And so we are excluding the amount that they've, by board action, said we're going to draw on our fund balance in FY19 to the extent of X dollars, and that's off the table in this proposed ordinance. I can get the line numbers here.
Well, that's fine.
So to just be really clear about that, so there shouldn't be any impact to current operations as a result of this.
Right, so Section 5, which starts on line 96, other provisions of this ordinance notwithstanding, the district may retain the amount of fund balance that was assigned for the subsequent year's expenditures, FY19, the year that we're in, as adopted by the school board prior to the start of the fiscal year.
So that shouldn't impact any monies that they have already set aside for operations.
Correct.
That's correct. So I had two questions other than that, if I might. The first one is, I just want to be clear, this last yellow line that says excluding reserved assigned for impact aid advance. And I'm assuming that is the impact aid that we expect to get. Is that correct?
No, it's the impact aid that they
That they've already
received
got for next
in-
year?
Yes.
Okay, so this is a known thing, but it's impact aid.
Correct.
Okay, so it takes me to my second question or clarification. So where it says total amount of unrestricted fund equity allowed to be accumulated, which is a fairly large number, that includes clearly the impact aid. So it is the new unrestricted fund equity plus impact aid, which would still be
It's
fairly...
got a calculated portion plus the impact aid. That's the
Which is a
total
fairly, still a fairly...
unrestricted amount that they can retain.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Lejeski?
Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm interpreting this all correct. So what is in my mind right now is we take the second yellow line plus the last yellow line, and that equals the very bottom line. That's the
Correct.
overall limit.
Correct.
And we're comparing that to the third yellow line, the unrestricted fund equity net added up of 33 million. And so when we look back over the last 10 years, this would have had zero impact on the last 9 years of operation had it been in effect,
No,
right?
no, that's why I clarified it.
Okay, I missed something. So what's the part I missed?
The part you missed is that this impact aid is not included in that.
Brady can help clarify here, perhaps.
Yeah, so the black letters in the middle, kind of, the unrestricted fund equity, that already excludes that impact aid.
Yes.
Okay. And then you were right that you take the second yellow line and the bottom yellow line, add those together to get that number, and then you are comparing that. So if you compare that to the 33 million and the 10 million, so if we were doing this in 18 for FY17, the difference between those two is the amount that would be going into the school district's facility maintenance reserve. So
4, 5, 6.
yeah,
Right, so if this had been in effect for 16, 17, there would have been roughly 12 and a half, 13-ish million that would have gone to the school district FMR.
Yeah.
But if we go before that, 15, 16 is 25 million versus 20, so it's under, no effect. And
yes, so many of those years are no effect, correct.
It
Because
looks to
they've
me-
only accumulated these large fund balances in the most recent years.
well, it looks to me that all of them are no effect except for the 16, 17, if we were talking about this going back in time and magically being implemented.
Right, and being implemented 1 year at a time with no other years around it, yes.
I was going to ask Ms. Brady, maybe you can comment on that, because I understand how this would work. You're right. So if we were applying this in 16, 17, the 12,466,000 to FMR, that would occur in the first year, but subsequent years, because the fund balance position has been reduced substantially, what goes into FMR going forward after that first year is going to be much less. Is that right?
That would make sense, because they would be closer to where they're operating at.
Right.
And so it would just amount to any lapse that pushes them over.
Right. Thanks. Other questions or comments at this point? Yeah. Ms. Dodge and then Mr. Roberts.
Well, in the 15-16, isn't there $12 million? That was a delta there that would also have lapsed? No?
So in 15-16, their unrestricted fund equity was 19,664,000.
right?
And the amount that they could accumulate was 24,874,000, which is
But-
higher.
But that includes the 14 million from impact aid, or 28 million.
Oh, correct. I see what you're saying. Yes, I understand what you're saying now.
So upwards to $12 million could have
Yes,
also
correct.
lapsed.
Correct.
No,
So-
it is not the line right above the bottom yellow line, the unrestricted fund
So-
equity over
so
under the
10 million,
proposed
9
limit.
million.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
line,
thank
that
you.
blue line, is what would
Have lapsed.
Yeah.
have lapsed to maintenance reserve in each of those years had this ordinance been applied to those years.
At that point
And that
in
is
time.
not cumulative, those are separate each year.
Correct.
Yes.
So that's
Correct.
actually about 25 million,
So-
close to 25 million that would have.
Apologize to Mr. Lejeski because I think I led you astray there. So that last blue line that's not double underscored, that, if you applied this at that point in time, those are the amounts. So 12 million, 9 million, and then there's some in the early years, some amounts in the earlier years.
Okay.
I have Mr. Roberts and Mr. Lujeski.
So, up till this last bit, I thought I had it all down.
And I apologize because I didn't do well there. I
So,
led you guys astray. I'm sorry
I'm
about that.
looking at the last blue line, and I thought that I'd take the difference between the unrestricted fund equity yellow line, so 33 million for 16-17. I'd subtract the 20 million in the bottom blue line, and I'd end up with this unrestricted fund equity of 12.4, even though that math doesn't quite work, but I was just looking at the first couple digits, and I thought, oh,
So
that works. But then I go over a notch, and it doesn't work at all.
So there's a calculated portion, and then the impact aid is added on after the fact. So that bottom double underscore line is the sum of that after you've added that on after the fact. So the calculated portion is that 18% against where they are, and
Right.
then they get that,
But this
get
is,
the impact aid on
the
top.
bottom blue line is the total amount they're allowed to keep at the end, right?
Yes,
Okay,
Including impact aid.
correct.
right. So, okay. So then, I'm confused as how you get with the unrestricted fund equity, the yellow line, and with the bottom blue line, how out of those two numbers, which I thought we were just looking at the difference of those two numbers, do we get the unrestricted fund equity blue line that was just mentioned as being what is actually going to lapse, the 9 million, the 12 million on the last 2 years there?
So I should have put line numbers on these. So they could have, if you just look at 2016-17,
Okay,
proposed limit for that year, $9,750,420. So that's the proposed limit. They had $33,025,393 of unrestricted fund equity, not counting impact aid advance. So the difference between those two is your $12,466,000.
well, not
Oh,
exactly.
that can't be right.
Plus, because you have to add in your impact aid, Debbie, and then you get
Yeah.
to the 12 million.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I still don't get how you
So
get to the 12
so it's
million.
really your unrestricted fund equity minus the number at the bottom, which is the
Correct.
total amount that you're allowed, is
Right.
going to be that 12,466,000,
But
which would be the
that-
amount.
But
Doesn't work in the
the
West
math
Virginia.
doesn't work out to that number, and it, especially in the next column over, doesn't work out to that number.
Should be negative 5 million.
So, it's like we're missing a row.
And
or
that
some-
could be, I might have hidden a line that I shouldn't have. I've got to think about this. Let me get back to you on that. I apologize. I thought I had this reviewed appropriately, but something doesn't look right to me either. And I think I may have hidden a row because I had a bunch of detail on this worksheet to begin with that was busy and
So-
confused matters.
Is that something that's going to take a while?
No, it'd be
Could
pretty
we
quick.
take a recess and wait for that?
Can you do it relatively quickly? Can we take a short recess, or do you
Yeah,
want?
I
is this-
can run upstairs and look. Yeah. Would you prefer that I continue with the presentation, and do
there's
you
more.
want to, I don't know how you want to do this. I don't want to mess your night up here.
Well, how much more presentation do you?
Just a conclusion.
Okay, let's go ahead and finish the presentation, Ms. Brady, and
then the mayor had more things to say, too.
and I've got
So you
Mr.
could do this.
Lajewski on the list and Mr. Tacky, so maybe with Mr. Roberts' question in mind, Mr. Lajewski,
No, you can strike mine until we get the new spreadsheet.
Mr. Tacky?
I just want to ask if you could email it. Okay, thanks.
And certainly, Ms. Brady can email it as well, but I'd like to see if we can get any questions we have on it answered
Yeah.
tonight while we're here.
Yeah,
So
and
one
I
thing that we
apologize.
could do procedurally, unless the clerk shoots me an evil glare, is when we get to the end of your presentation and the questions have ended on what we have, we can adjourn to reconvene immediately after the committee of the whole. Does that work? Okay.
Wasn't an evil glare.
It was a nod of approval, so, all right. So go ahead and proceed, Ms. Brady.
Okay. So, in conclusion, in addition to the school district having the ability to request a waiver of the provision, of the lapse provision itself, they also have the option, as the mayor stated, of coming at budget time or any time during the year if they have a need, and make a request to retain additional unrestricted fund balance for specific school board priorities. And then that concludes my portion of the report, and I'll turn it back over to the mayor and Jim for things that they want
Mr.
to.
Williams had a couple of capital-type comments.
So the mayor asked me to make a couple statements about the school district FMR fund and kind of the history of it, and kind of some practical implications of the balance changing. So right now there's about $1.9 million sitting in that fund, and that's kind of the low end of where Mr. Sloan wants to keep that, just in case we get a Cat 5 hurricane or a tornado or something go through. And you got to be able to fix stuff if it happens in an emergency. If you look in the middle of your spreadsheet on the first page, you can see back to 2006, 2007, the total, well, each of the contributions that were made to the school district FMR, 2009, 2010 was 2.1 in change 2.1 million in change contribution. And then you can see as we go through 2013, 2014, and then it zeroes out 15, 16, and 17. So the sum of those is around 5.5 million. If the ordinance was to go pass as designed, you're looking at a 10 to 15 million dollar just shooting from the hip contribution. Depends on how the school district financials shake out when we see the audited reports to add on to that the current balance that we have right now. And that's important because we're working with the school district right now, and the Capital Projects Committee, Mr. Quist is very much aware of this. We've identified several projects from the school district that are emerging as priorities for pretty significant capital maintenance projects. For example, Barnett Phase 4 is still the school district's #1 priority at $14.27 million to complete. Mr. Sloan and Mr. Norm are concerned about some roofs, about 3 roofs at about $6.1 million worth of work that really needs to be done. It's in that urgent category. And then we have some other kind of significant upgrades for lighting and electrical system upgrades. So totaling just what's hitting our deck right now is about $29 million in capital projects that's kind of poking up right now. And those numbers are going up in cost every year. The inflationary factor on that continues to increase, and the amount of value in the fund balances does not keep up with that because of our investment strategy. So that money loses value faster than the amount of the cost of the project. So I just wanted to bring that to the Assembly's attention and let you know we're kind of thinking ahead about how we intend to operate this. So I'll take any questions.
Mr. Quist?
Thank you. I have two, one for the administration and one for the attorney, I think. So were representatives from the school district invited to this work session? I mean, I know that there's kind of like an open thing with a standing invitation maybe, but I get, or maybe anybody who wants to try to answer that question, was the school district invited to participate in this work session?
I can answer briefly. I can't speak for the administration, but I extended an invitation to Ms. Haas for a member of the Board of Education to participate on the dais. So,
thank you. Wait, I have a question for the attorney about, so how is it that this ordinance, or even the code as it is now, which is in a lot of ways very similar to the proposed ordinance, how is this different than the assembly telling the school district how to use the appropriation? Hopefully I'm asking that question clearly enough.
So I don't think the assembly is telling the school district how to use the appropriation, nor can they. So what the assembly does by law is give the operational money for the district to them in its annual budget. So you approve the total amount of the school district budget, including the amount from local sources. By state law, you don't have control over the educational policy decisions of the district. The school board has that. What you have is the financial responsibility for the district. So because you have the taxing authority, you decide on an annual basis, okay, I have this amount of resources I'm going to raise from taxpayers, and this is how I'm going to allocate them. And because the school district is in its own taxing jurisdiction, it's no different than other borough departments for purposes of tax revenue and how you're going to make spending decisions, other than you have a required local contribution under state law. It's no different than if you said in the first instance, we're not going to appropriate as much to you. So it's giving them the money, giving them the flexibility throughout the school year, but requiring it be spent for operational purposes because you have limited resources that you can allocate. So it's distinguished from you saying, we're going to veto part of your budget, or we're going to not approve part of your budget. You don't have that discretion. So you're saying to them, this money is available to you. We're not going to tell you how to use it. You have freedom to do whatever decisions you need to make with it through the year, but it has to be used for that purpose.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Sense?
Other questions? Say I have a follow-on question for Mr. Quist's question. You know, as opposed to, and I don't know that if I can articulate this well, but it seems that there'd be a difference between this type of, and maybe, well, is there a difference really between this type of mechanism where it is, you know, saying, okay, if you don't spend the money, then some of it comes back to the borough, and reducing the local contribution from during the budget process? I mean, does that make sense?
I think it could happen either way.
Okay.
So I think if you didn't have a lapse, I think the goal, if you look at the history, the goal is really to tax enough that there's enough resources for every borough function, school district included, not to overtax, not to undertax. So the goal is to have that right amount, which of course doesn't really happen because they're budgets and they're fluid and they change from year to year. So you could do it that way. You could reduce that amount, but then your mill levy is based on that reduced amount and your budgeted amount. So you don't have the revenue in the first instance or the opportunity. So
I guess I was getting is operationally it seems less flexible, but
oh, well, yeah, that I
reduce,
guess
yeah.
it's less flexible for the, I'm sorry, I was looking at it from the
no, I was
from the perspective of the taxing authority, but from the school district's perspective, you're right, it would be less flexible because they'd have less revenue available to them on July 1.
okay. Other questions at this point? If there aren't any questions, a motion to adjourn to immediately follow the committee of the whole would be
Move to adjourn until the end of the committee of the whole meeting.
Second.
Is there any objection? Seeing no objection, the Finance Committee is adjourned to reconvene immediately following the Committee of the Whole. I am going to call the Finance Committee back to order. The prior roll call can stand. As we noted, Mr. Quist joined us. So we'll go back to Ms. Brady and a new spreadsheet marked revised that the clerk has given to everybody.
Okay.
Brady.
Thank you. I sincerely and humbly apologize for the confusion on the errors, and it turned out to just be a formula error, and your revised sheet shows here. And thank you also for your indulgence in allowing us to reconvene and giving me a chance to correct this. So part of the confusion, I think, in where the questions were going was how can these numbers work? So one of the things to remember at the outset is that the assignment for the impact aid advance is kind of outside this calculation process. And so when you're looking at this middle unrestricted fund equity section, it already excludes the impact aid advance assignment. So that $33,025,393 in the column for FY 16-17, unrestricted is actually more by that $10,884,000. So it's more like $44 million of unrestricted funds for 16-17. So the new line, which is under the strike-through line, shows that there would be 23 million that would be over. So that's the amount, and then they get the 10 million, that's the assignment for impact aid advance, is separate and distinct from that calculation and gets kind of added on at the end. I'm not sure if that helped, but go with the questions.
So I had Mr. Lejeski first from the last round, then Mr. Lawrence.
Okay, so I understand the whole cumulative process here. But if this had been applied, this proposed ordinance, say just to 06-07, that would have meant at the end of that year there would have been a $4.4 million lapse into the FMR.
Correct.
But because if that would have happened in that year, in 2007-08, probably nothing.
Correct.
Because it would have been roughly that much lower to begin with.
Correct.
So we're looking at, if this was applied to 16-17, 23 million going into the school FMR.
Correct.
Okay, I guess that's pretty easy to interpret, so I think this is a good chart now, or a good spreadsheet.
Mr. Lawrence?
Yeah, just to make sure I understand, that impact aid is from the federal government. It's paid a year in advance. The school district is supposed to not touch that money, right? I mean, that's...
I can't answer that. I don't know what it's unrestricted from a governmental, generally accepted accounting principles. So it has no external restrictions that are recognized under GAAP that it has to be restricted. It is not restricted. It's unrestricted.
But if the federal government was to go out of business, or decide not to give any impact aid, then the year that it was designated for, well, certainly there is reason, you could say it's prudent for them not to spend that money until the year in which it was supposedly
Correct.
designated
An analogy
for.
might be community assistance. If we got our community assistance in advance, we don't have any restrictions per se. I mean, we have to use it for, we can use it for taxpayer relief, I mean, which is a pretty broad category, but we don't have anything. It's unrestricted when it comes to us. And if we got that in advance, it'd be a similar scenario where we get it in advance, but it's really intended for this year, the succeeding year, and they get it in advance of the year for which it's intended.
So it's like opening up a Christmas present before Christmas.
And not being able to use it.
Well, no, you
Not
use
using
it, then you don't have anything on Christmas
That's what I
morning.
mean, not using it.
Mr. Tacky?
Thank you.
So did you say that 10 million, like we're using 16-17 as an example, is not included in the
Correct.
33 million, even
Correct.
though it's unrestricted?
Correct, because the proposed ordinance lets them keep that regardless of what else is going on with their fund balance.
Gotcha, okay.
Additional questions or discussion? Mr. Roberts?
No, I just wanted to thank you for the new sheet. Now it makes perfect sense.
Good, thank you.
I was just going to say for new members and perhaps kind of new members, this $10 million is part of what we consider making the school district whole. So when you hear arguments about we're not giving them 100%, we consider this $10 million to be part of that 100%.
Right. Goes back to, Other questions or discussion on this ordinance at this point? All right, seeing none, Thank you, Ms. Brady. See you next week. Takes us to other committee business and discussion items, monthly budget reports and general fund updated fund balance reports. Anybody want to, any of the outgoing assembly members want to take their opportunity to talk about these exciting fund balance reports before they leave? All right.
They're lovely.
Seeing none, we'll go to mayor and assembly comments limited to finance committee items. Mayor Castle, any finance-related comments?
Thank you for your patience as we waded through this school lapse ordinance. And other than that, I guess I'm just available for questions.
Any questions for the mayor on finance-related topics? All right, we'll go to assembly comments on finance topics. Mr. Tackey,
I have no comment this evening.
Mr. Lujeski,
23 million is a lot of money, that's all.
Mr. Gray,
None, thank you.
Mr. Lawrence,
No comment.
Ms. Dodge,
No comment.
Mr. Roberts, Mr. Quist.
Thank you. I'm a little perplexed and maybe bewildered as to why the school district chose not to participate, or the Board of Education chose not to participate in the conversation about this significant ordinance during our Finance Committee, especially given that one of the concerns expressed at our last meeting was that they didn't feel like they had a voice in the process, and there's an opportunity that wasn't taken advantage of. So, anyways, thank you.
All right. Now I can say that Mr. Roberts, Ms. Dodge, and Mr. Lawrence have finished their last Finance Committee meeting. So with that, Finance Committee is adjourned.